All right, everybody, we've got a lot of moving pieces in the atmosphere right now, and I need you to stick with me through this whole update because the picture has shifted, and honestly, it's shifted in a direction that's making me a little more concerned than I was just a day or two ago. As we move through the rest of this week and push into next week, the story keeps evolving, and unfortunately, it's not evolving in the way a lot of us were hoping for. We do still have cooler air trying to work its way into the country, but that cooler air is not digging nearly as deep as it was before. And right behind it, the heat is coming back, and it's coming back hard. Summer is not ready to let go just yet. In fact, some of the highest heat indices you're going to feel all year are set to show up across the southeast over the next several days. On top of all that, we've got the tropics waking up. There's nothing threatening in the Atlantic that I'm worried about yet, but out in the Pacific, there's a system that's got my attention, and it looks like it's taking aim at Hawaii with the potential to become another hurricane. So let's break all of this down piece by piece, starting with the severe weather that's already impacted a big chunk of the country. Yesterday was a rough day for a couple of areas. Wisconsin took a beating from straight-line winds, and we had a good number of wind damage reports come out of that state. The Southeast also got hit hard with damaging winds, and the fallout from that is still being felt today in the form of widespread power outages. Right now, the Southeast is sitting at more than 187,000 homes and businesses without power. Indiana is still dealing with roughly 84,000 outages. Kansas has about 18,000 customers in the dark, and Wisconsin, still cleaning up from yesterday's damage, has around 18,000 outages of its own. And then there's Hawaii, which already has about 22,000 without power, and given what's brewing out in the Pacific, there's a real chance that number climbs even higher before this is all said and done. Now let's talk about today, because we are not done with severe weather just yet. There's another round of wind threats spreading across a good stretch of the country today, and I'll walk you through exactly which states and cities need to be paying attention. On top of the wind threat, there's also a tornado risk in play for a couple of specific areas today. Out of everywhere I'm watching, the region I actually believe has legitimate tornado potential is the corridor running through Missouri, into Tennessee, and into Kentucky. Everywhere else that's technically been flagged, I'm not convinced we're going to see an actual tornado spin up, but that Missouri-Tennessee-Kentucky stretch is the one I want you watching closely today. Here's how the timeline unfolds. As we move through this morning and into the evening hours, storms are going to start firing up over eastern Nebraska and eastern South Dakota. That activity ramps up through the morning and carries into the lunchtime hours before the broader storm threat really expands. At the same time, we're going to see storms build across the Four Corners region, meaning Arizona, stretching into Colorado and northern New Mexico as well. But the area I really want to draw your attention to is what develops across southern Iowa, Missouri, and pushes into Illinois and Indiana. That's where we're going to see thunderstorms fire up, and that's also where the tornado threat I mentioned becomes possible later this evening, specifically across southeastern Missouri, southern Illinois, and western Kentucky. As the evening goes on, that activity organizes into a cluster of thunderstorms that will bring heavy rainfall and damaging winds along with it. When you look at this setup, there's real potential for multiple supercells today, and some of these could get strong. For folks in northern Missouri, I think your primary threat is going to be wind rather than tornadoes, mainly because we just don't have a lot of strong winds aloft in that part of the atmosphere right now. But once you move south into southern Missouri, southern Illinois, and toward the western Tennessee and Kentucky border, those winds aloft really start to kick in, and that's exactly why the severe threat increases so much in that corridor. Then, as we roll into tomorrow morning, that same energy pushes across the Ohio Valley, bringing another round of thunderstorms. And it doesn't stop there, because tomorrow the threat builds again, this time up into the northeast. And we're talking about the potential for straight-line wind damage with gusts that could reach 50 to 60 miles per hour. The damaging wind threat could stretch all the way from Long Island down through the Delmarva Peninsula. Meanwhile, thunderstorms are also expected to spark back up across the southeast tomorrow. So this isn't a one-region problem. It's spread out across a wide chunk of the eastern half of the country. I want to explain a little bit about why the setup matters so much, because when you look at the winds aloft, that's really the ingredient that helps fuel convection, helps provide lift, and gives you that wind direction change with height that increases the chances for tornadoes to form. Right now, if you look at today's setup across southern Iowa and northern Missouri, those winds aloft are actually pretty weak, which is part of why I'm not overly worried about tornadoes forming in that specific zone. But later this evening, once those stronger cells move into southeastern Missouri, southern Illinois, and western Tennessee and Kentucky, the winds pick up significantly, and that's where the real threat sets up overnight and into the early morning hours. Then tomorrow, as all of that shifts toward the northeast, we could be looking at some very strong damaging winds up there as well. Beyond the wind shear, you also have to factor in instability. essentially the fuel that thunderstorms feed on. As we go through the evening, there's some instability building over northern Missouri, but it really ramps up across southern Missouri and continues into southern Illinois and western Tennessee and Kentucky overnight. That combination of instability and wind shear is what's going to keep these storms firing through the overnight hours. Then tomorrow, that same kind of energy builds toward the northeast, stretching from Virginia across the Delmarva region into Delaware, New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania, and all the way up toward Long Island. That entire stretch could see a significant severe weather event tomorrow. When you look at the latest short-range model output, updated in 15-minute increments, you can see storms firing up later this evening across northern Indiana and northern Missouri, as well as southern Missouri. As the evening progresses, the storms across the northern tier actually start to weaken. But down across southern Missouri into southern Illinois and western Kentucky, that's where the storms strengthen through the evening hours and bring the strongest winds with them, with the northern edge of that activity capable of producing 50 to 60 mile per hour wind gusts. Interestingly, the activity kind of stalls out after northern Missouri and then picks back up again as it moves through southern Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky. That same model run also shows storms building across the Four Corners, meaning Arizona, New Mexico, the Texas Panhandle, and into Colorado. So if you're out that way, keep an eye on the sky through the evening hours as well. Looking ahead to tomorrow specifically, I don't think we're dealing with a tornado threat at that point. It's going to be primarily a wind threat, and I actually think that risk could get bumped up, particularly across the Northeast. So keep watching for updates on which cities and states end up included in that wind risk zone for Thursday. Now, let's shift over to the tropics, because there's a lot happening in both oceans right now, and I want to make sure you're fully caught up. Starting in the Pacific, we've got Invest 90E, and this system currently has a 70% chance of development within the next 48 hours, and that jumps up to an 80% chance over the next 7 days. In other words, a tropical depression is very likely to form out of this system within the next couple of days. It's currently moving westward, trending toward west-northwestward, at a forward speed of about 10 to 15 miles per hour. The track looks fairly similar to a previous system that impacted the islands, just positioned a little farther south. When you look at the newest ensemble data, including the GFS model, the track has actually nudged a bit closer to the islands, although the average track still keeps it just offshore. That said, even if the center passes to the south, you're still going to feel real impacts from this thing in the form of heavy rain and strong wind. Here's the part that concerns me the most. When I look at the intensity models for this system, there's a real chance it strengthens quickly, potentially going from a tropical storm all the way up to a Category 1 or Category 2 hurricane in a short window of time. Part of the reason for that is the upper-level high-pressure system currently in place, which is going to rotate everything in a clockwise direction and effectively push this storm on a more westward track. As you look further out in the model runs, that westward push becomes even more pronounced. But even with that westward nudge, the storm still ends up skimming very close to the islands. And by about 5 days out, both the Euro and GFS models are showing this thing reaching hurricane strength, with the Euro leaning toward a strong tropical storm to hurricane, and the GFS actually showing an even stronger hurricane. The timing on the more significant impacts looks like it lines up with overnight Sunday into Monday. And given what these islands just went through recently, this is going to bring another round of serious impacts. When we compare the two main models for expected impacts, the Euro paints a slightly better case scenario, keeping the strongest winds a bit farther offshore, but even in that scenario, you're still looking at 40 to 50 mile per hour wind gusts, with the Big Island bearing the brunt of it. The GFS, on the other hand, takes a stronger approach. And if that verifies, the winds would not only be stronger, but they'd also spread farther north to impact some of the other islands as well. Rainfall is honestly where I'm most concerned. Even with the Euro's more conservative track, we're still talking about the potential for another 7 to 8 inches of rain on the Big Island, with meaningful rainfall expected across the other islands too. The GFS brings even more tropical moisture into the picture, which would mean even heavier rainfall impacts. So if you're in Hawaii, this is one to take seriously and keep a close eye on as the forecast continues to sharpen up over the next few days. Switching over to the Atlantic, the good news is that the National Hurricane Center currently has nothing flagged for development over the next 7 days. Historically, as we move through September, we typically see a high-pressure system set up near Bermuda that steers tropical systems around it in a particular direction. And that's exactly the pattern we need to be watching for going forward. Right now, there's no indication of any legitimate threat to the United States. There's a small chance we could see something try to organize near the Leeward Islands or the Lesser Antilles, and maybe something brush past Bermuda. But as of right now, the overall trend keeps any activity farther north and away from the U.S. mainland. If you look at the longer-range GFS model output, stretching out 8 days, there's a signal showing something potentially developing near the Leeward Islands. But I want to be clear about something important here, because this is a mistake I see people make constantly on social media. Any single model run showing something 8 days out needs to be taken with a huge grain of salt, especially if it's not consistent from one run to the next and isn't showing any kind of clear trend. When you actually look at the ensemble members for the GFS, only 1 out of 4 is showing any kind of tropical depression forming at all, and the rest are showing that dry air is simply too strong and is preventing development. If something were to eventually form down the road, it's more likely to be the result of a frontal boundary interacting with tropical moisture rather than a classic tropical wave spinning up on its own. And again, we're talking about a 2-week outlook here, so take all of this as a long-range possibility, not an imminent threat. The European model, which honestly has been remarkably accurate all year long, is showing that if anything does eventually develop, it would likely only be 1 or 2 systems total in the Atlantic, and even those wouldn't be particularly strong. The rest of the ensemble members point toward nothing more than a weak tropical wave passing through, mostly just adding a bit of extra moisture to the atmosphere. When you look at the upper-level moisture fields, there's a pocket of moisture where this tropical wave is attempting to organize, but it's surrounded by a substantial amount of dry air, and that dry air is winning the battle right now. Looking 5 to 6 days out, that wave essentially gets pushed and pulled around the high-pressure system with no real threat developing from it. There is a subsequent tropical wave behind it that could become a bit stronger, but even that one is expected to swirl around the Azores high and get pulled out to sea fairly quickly, all while we continue seeing these cold fronts move through. Even the satellite imagery backs this up. If anything tries to form, it looks like it would remain a weak tropical wave, mostly just bringing extra moisture into the picture, because there's still a substantial amount of dry air and Saharan dust wrapped up around the system. Looking at the probability of any of these waves eventually becoming a tropical cyclone, the track generally shows it moving toward the west into the main development region before eventually getting pulled farther north, again keeping it away from any land threat. There's also some new data worth mentioning regarding what's called potential velocity anomaly, essentially a way of measuring how favorable or unfavorable the atmosphere is for tropical development. Looking at the main development region across the Atlantic, from now through August, September, and even into October, the overall environment looks like it's going to remain largely unfavorable for development. This is actually a fairly normal pattern during a strong El Niño year, which tends to increase wind shear across the tropical Atlantic and suppress storm formation. As we move into the beginning of September, there's a brief window where conditions look closer to neutral, maybe even slightly favorable, but for the most part, we're expecting a continued tug of war in the main development region, with systems more likely to get pushed straight out into the open Atlantic as what we call fish storms, meaning they curve out to sea without ever threatening land, while the real convection and lift stays locked in over the Pacific. There's also a chance we'll need to watch for something more frontally driven near the Gulf or East Coast later on, but that's a different mechanism than a classic tropical system. This has honestly been the dominant theme of the entire hurricane season so far, and based on everything I'm seeing, I expect that trend to continue right on through September. Now let's shift gears and talk about the broader weather pattern, because this is where things get a little more complicated. We do still have a cooler front working through the country this week, and for folks up north, it's going to feel pretty nice. I do want to be upfront with you, though. This cool front, much like the reinforcing shot of heat we're expecting next week, is not digging nearly as deep south as previous fronts have. When you look at the Arctic oscillation data, you can see that cooler air associated with this week's front, and even the slightly stronger front expected next week, but as we push toward the very end of August into September, that cooler air pattern essentially exits, and we transition into an entirely new weather regime. And it's a fairly sharp transition too. If you look at the East Pacific Oscillation, or EPO, that helps explain a lot of what we're dealing with. Remember, the heat currently building across the south and southeast lines, up with a positive EPO face. When the EPO flips negative, that typically brings ridging along the west coast and a trough digging into the central and eastern United States, which is essentially what's fueling this week's cooler front. That negative phase looks like it's going to linger for a bit longer. But if you look at both the GFS and the European model, there's a noticeably sharp turn showing up right around the end of August, signaling that this pattern is about to flip. The North Atlantic Oscillation, or NAO, tells a similar story. This is essentially the mechanism that helps pull cooler air down into the country. As I mentioned before, we're expecting a fairly rare weather setup that brings in a genuinely strong cold front, but the models are showing that this pattern is going to reverse itself just as sharply as it arrived. You can see a negative dip in the NAO data, representing a blocking pattern that helps deliver that cooler front as we move into next week. But almost as quickly as that dip shows up, the models bring it right back toward neutral and even into positive territory shortly after. In plain terms, that means after we get this nice stretch of cooler air next week, the heat is going to come roaring right back. And unfortunately, that's just the reality of where this pattern is headed. I know that's probably not what everybody wants to hear, but my job isn't to tell you what you want to hear. It's to give you the most accurate picture I can, good news or bad news, so you can plan accordingly. Just make sure you're staying updated regularly, because weather patterns like this one can and do shift. Looking at this week specifically, you can see a cooler anomaly settling in across the Great Lakes, stretching into the northeast, and also across parts of the south, which lines up with the thunderstorm activity we've already talked about. At the same time, there's a building heat ridge that stretches from the west all the way across the south. As we transition into next week, the European model shows that cooler anomaly retreating during the first half of the week, with a second wave of cooler air arriving during the back half, though the second round is going to be noticeably weaker and mostly limited to northern areas. Meanwhile, that heat ridge builds right back up as we approach next weekend, and it actually expands farther east, while also allowing cooler air to filter into the west as we head toward September. So essentially, right after this upcoming cool front moves through next week, which honestly should feel pretty nice for a lot of people, the heat comes right back. There's something specific I want you to watch for here too. The GFS model has a consistent tendency to push these cooler anomalies much farther south than they typically end up verifying, and this run is no exception. When you look at the heat pattern this particular model run is showing, it's not just failing to push that cool air deep into the south, it's actually showing the heat building back up even stronger than most other guidance suggests, and that's part of why I'm a little more concerned than usual. Specifically, looking out toward next Friday, the 28th, the GFS shows a stronger storm system pulling those cooler temperatures much farther south than other models agree with. When you compare that same time frame to the European model, you still see cooler temperatures arriving with the front, just not nearly as deep into the southern states. If you look at the actual forecast highs tied to the GFS scenario, some areas under that front would stay in the 70s, even dipping into the 60s, but that's only according to the GFS. And even in that same model run, once you get south of that front, the heat comes roaring right back, with a massive heat dome stretching from the south all the way up into Canada, and then wrapping back around into the southwest. Right now, that setup is not trending consistently, and the European model tells a very different story, keeping that heat on more of a northwesterly trajectory rather than pushing it broadly northward the way the GFS suggests. So at this point, I think the GFS is overdoing the extremes on both ends, the depth of the cool front, and the intensity of the heat rebound, but I'll continue monitoring it because these things can shift. If you look at the latest outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, covering the next 6 to 10 days, the jet stream is expected to run below average, but again, it's not projected to dig especially far south. What stands out most is a large area of above average temperature anomalies stretching from Montana all the way down through Texas and Louisiana, representing a substantial amount of heat. The newest heat outlook actually designates a high risk of dangerous heat from the 26th through the 28th of August across New Mexico, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, and western Arkansas, with the potential for that heat to linger into Louisiana as well. Surrounding that high-risk zone, there's also a moderate risk area stretching from Louisiana over toward Arizona. On top of all that, what we're dealing with this week alone is already shaping up to be some of the hottest temperatures we've seen all year, and that's backed up by the National Weather Service, which has noted that many areas could see their hottest temperatures, not just of this year, but in the past several years. A big part of what makes this heat event so dangerous is the lack of overnight relief, with urban areas in some cases not cooling below 80 degrees even at night. It's important to understand the impact categories here too. Major impacts are expected to affect anyone without access to effective cooling or adequate hydration, meaning this isn't just a discomfort issue. It's a genuine health risk for a lot of people. Then there's the extreme impact category, which represents rare or unusually long duration heat events with little to no overnight relief whatsoever. And that's exactly the kind of pattern we're looking at in some areas. If you look at the latest heat risk mapping, that extreme category, shown in purple on most of these maps, stretches across the southeast and extends into Mississippi, Texas, and Oklahoma, as well as into the southwest. Areas falling into that purple zone are the ones where nighttime temperatures simply aren't dropping enough to provide meaningful relief from the heat. As for timing, today and tomorrow this heat is expected to be firmly in place and actually intensify even further. By Friday and Saturday, we should start to see a bit of a pivot in the pattern.